Picture a courtroom where the air crackles with tension, not just because of the verdict at stake, but because the trial itself is a battlefield one where words wield more power than swords, and the wrong sentence could topple a dynasty. This was the reality of medieval justice, a world where law and raw ambition collided in spectacular fashion. Behind every accusation, every dramatic testimony, lay a web of political intrigue, personal vendettas, and the unrelenting hunger for control. These weren't just legal proceedings, they were high-stakes performances staged before kings, clerics, and crowds, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. What made these medieval courtroom dramas so gripping wasn't just the crimes being tried, it was the way justice itself could be twisted, manipulated, or outright ignored by those who held the reins of power. Take, for instance, the trial of a nobleman accused of treason. On the surface, it might seem like a straightforward case of loyalty to the crown, but dig deeper, and you'd find a king desperate to eliminate a rival, or a queen using the law to silence an enemy. The courtroom became a chessboard, and every move, every witness, every piece of evidence was a calculated play in a much larger game. That's what we're about to uncover together. 25 of the most explosive legal battles from the Middle Ages, each one a window into the ruthless strategies that shaped empires. From the infamous trials of fallen favorites to the hushed, deadly intrigues of ecclesiastical courts, these stories reveal how justice was often just another weapon in the hands of the powerful. So prepare to step into the shadows of history's grandest courtrooms where the drama was real, the stakes were life or death, and the verdicts echoed far beyond the walls of the hall. This isn't just history, it's a masterclass in how power truly worked. To grasp the sheer drama of medieval courtroom battles, we first need to step into the minds of the people who lived them. Imagine a world where a noble's word carried more weight than a peasant's sworn testimony, where justice could be decided by holding a red-hot iron. If your hand healed cleanly, God had declared you innocent. This wasn't just law, it was theater, ritual, and raw power all rolled into one. The courtroom itself was rarely a quiet hall of reasoned debate. More often, it was a crowded, chaotic space where the accused might face trial by combat, fighting for their life literally and figuratively, or endure the terrifying spectacle of an ordeal by water, thrown into a river to let divine will determine their fate. At the heart of it all was a simple, brutal truth. The law served those who controlled it. Kings and lords used courts to reinforce their authority, while the church wielded its own legal system to punish heresy and dissent. There were no juries in the modern sense, no careful weighing of forensic evidence. Instead, verdicts could hinge on the testimony of a single influential witness, or vanish entirely if the right palms were greased. Even the concept of innocent until proven guilty was foreign in many places. If you stood accused, the burden often fell on you to prove your innocence through oath swearing, physical trials, or the favor of powerful patrons. This system created perfect conditions for explosive drama. A trial wasn't just about the crime, it was about alliances, reputation, and survival. A merchant accused of cheating might bribe his way to freedom, while a knight could demand trial by combat to prove his honesty with a sword. And then there were the political trials where the real crime wasn't treason or theft, but threatening the wrong person's grip on power. These were the cases where the courtroom became a stage, the verdict a foregone conclusion, and the true lesson was about who ruled and who dared to cross them. By understanding these rules, or lack thereof, the cases we're about to explore take on new meaning. They weren't just legal disputes, they were battles in a larger war where the law was just another weapon. And sometimes the most shocking verdicts had nothing to do with justice at all. Few conflicts capture the explosive tension between sacred and secular power like the trial of Thomas Beckett. Here was a man who had once been King Henry II's closest confidant, his chancellor and friend, elevated to the highest religious office in England only to become the king's most formidable adversary. The heart of their dispute was deceptively simple. Who held the final say over the clergy? Henry insisted that priests accused of crimes should face royal courts like any other subject. Beckett, once a loyal servant of the crown, transformed into an unyielding defender of the church's independence, refusing to let earthly powers dictate divine justice. What began as a legal debate quickly spiraled into a high-stakes showdown. Henry convened a council at Northampton in 1164, summoning Beckett to answer charges of embezzlement and treason accusations many saw as thinly veiled retaliation for the Archbishop's defiance. The trial was less about evidence and more about humiliation. Beckett, dressed in full ecclesiastical robes, strode into the hall clutching a cross, turning the proceedings into a spectacle. When the nobles demanded he submit to the king's judgment, he famously replied, "I appeal to the Pope," invoking a higher authority and throwing the courtroom into chaos. The aftermath was even more dramatic. Henry's infamous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" was taken as a command by 4 knights who rode to Canterbury and cut Beckett down before the altar. But the murder didn't silence dissent, it ignited a firestorm. Beckett was swiftly canonized, his shrine becoming a pilgrimage site that drew thousands, while Henry was forced to perform public penance, walking barefoot through the streets as monks scourged him. The church's victory was symbolic but profound. It cemented the idea that spiritual authority could defy even the mightiest monarch. This trial wasn't just a personal feud, it was a turning point in medieval history. Beckett's defiance and martyrdom exposed the fragility of royal power when it clashed with faith. Future kings would tread carefully around ecclesiastical courts, and the church's influence grew stronger than ever. Yet the real lesson lies in the courtroom itself, where what seemed like a simple legal dispute became a battleground for the soul of a nation. The echoes of this clash would resonate for centuries, proving that in the medieval world, the fight for control often played out not on the battlefield, but in the hallowed halls of justice. Joan of Arc's trial wasn't just a prosecution. It was a meticulously orchestrated demolition of a peasant girl who had dared to defy empires. At just 19 years old, she stood accused not merely of heresy, but of something far more dangerous to her captors, undermining the very legitimacy of English rule in France. Her claims of divine visions, her leadership on the battlefield, her role in crowning Charles VII, all of it had to be erased, and the courtroom was the chosen weapon. The English needed more than a victory in war. They needed to prove Joan was no saint, but a heretic, a fraud, a tool of the devil. What unfolded in Rouen in 1431 was a masterclass in political theatre. The tribunal, stacked with clergymen loyal to England, twisted scripture like a noose. They grilled Joan for months, probing for contradictions in her faith, demanding she deny the voices she swore guided her. "Who told you to wear men's clothing?" they demanded, turning her practical battlefield attire into evidence of sin. "Does God hate the English?" they baited, trying to paint her as a zealot. Yet Joan, with no formal education, matched them at every turn. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a theological trap, since no mortal could claim such certainty, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The courtroom gasped. Even her enemies recognized the brilliance of her answer, but the trial's outcome was never in doubt. the verdict was decided long before the first question was asked. Joan's real crime wasn't heresy, it was winning. Her victories at Orleans and Patay had revived French morale, and her presence alone threatened English dominance. Burning her at the stake was meant to extinguish the hope she'd ignited, yet the flames that consumed her body only amplified her legend. Within years, the Church would declare her trial unjust, and centuries later, she'd be canonized as a saint. The trial of Joan of Arc reveals a bitter truth about medieval justice. Courts could be tools of conquest as much as instruments of law. Her accusers didn't seek truth, they sought control. And in the end, their desperation to destroy her only ensured she'd never be forgotten. The courtroom failed to silence her. Instead, it gave her a stage for the ages. The downfall of the Knights Templar stands as one of history's most brazen acts of legal theater, a king's desperate cash grab disguised as holy justice. By 1307, the Templars had become more than just warrior monks. They were Europe's first multinational banking empire, lending vast sums to kings and nobles while amassing land, castles, and influence. But their power made them a target, especially for a ruler like Philip IV of France, drowning in debt and hungry for their wealth. What followed wasn't a trial, it was a meticulously staged purge, where accusations of heresy became the perfect cover for robbery on a royal scale. Philip moved with chilling precision. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, a date so infamous it still lingers in superstition, his officers arrested hundreds of Templars across France in a single coordinated sweep. The charges were sensational: spitting on the cross, worshipping a demonic idol called Baphomet, engaging in secretive homosexual rituals. Yet these claims didn't emerge from genuine suspicion. They were extracted through methods that would make even medieval torturers flinch. Templar knights were stretched on the rack, burned with hot irons, starved in dungeons until their confessions matched the king's script. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, after days of agony, signed a confession he later recanted, shouting from the flames of his execution pyre that both Philip and the Pope would soon face divine judgment. The courtroom proceedings that followed were a mockery of justice. Church officials, many under Philip's thumb, ignored the Templars' retractions and their pleas for fair hearings. When some knights mustered the courage to defend their order in public trials, the king simply had them burned as relapsed heretics, silencing dissent with fire. Even Pope Clement V, initially skeptical of the charges, eventually caved to Philip's pressure, dissolving the order in 1312 and handing its riches to the French crown. What makes the Templar trials so revealing isn't just the scale of the deception, it's how effortlessly the machinery of law was hijacked for naked greed. Philip didn't just want the Templars' gold, he needed to legitimize his theft. By framing their destruction as holy duty, he turned robbery into righteousness. And in doing so, he exposed a truth that echoed through medieval courts. When power and money collided, justice was often the first casualty. The Templars' real crime wasn't heresy, it was being too wealthy to survive in a world where kings wrote the rules. Eleanor of Aquitaine's trial wasn't just a royal scandal, it was a seismic clash between a queen who refused to kneel and a king determined to break her. As the wife of Henry II and mother of future kings like Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor wielded influence few women of her time could dream of. But when she sided with her sons in their revolt against Henry, the king didn't just see betrayal, he saw an opportunity. The courtroom became his weapon, and the charges of rebellion his excuse to strip her of power. What followed was less a trial than a coronation in reverse, a public dismantling of the most formidable woman in Europe. The proceedings in 1173 were a masterstroke of humiliation. Eleanor, once the dazzling queen who had ruled Aquitaine in her own right and accompanied Louis VII on crusade, was now paraded before a tribunal of nobles handpicked by Henry. No evidence was presented, no defense permitted. The verdict had been decided long before she entered the room. Her real crime wasn't rebellion, it was ambition. By supporting her son's claim to power, she dared to challenge Henry's absolute control, and that was a sin no medieval king could forgive. The court's ruling was swift. Eleanor would spend the next 16 years imprisoned, her political influence extinguished, her voice silenced. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor's defiance echoed. While Henry locked her away in castles across England, she became a living symbol of resistance, her legend growing with each passing year. The court had tried to erase her, but it only cemented her place in history. When Henry finally died and her son Richard took the throne, one of his first acts was to free his mother, proof that her gamble, though costly, hadn't been in vain. Eleanor's trial exposes the brutal calculus of medieval justice. For kings, courts weren't just for dispensing fairness, they were tools to crush threats, especially when those threats came from within their own families. Her story reminds us that in an era when power was everything, even queens could be toppled by the right legal fiction. But it also shows something darker, how easily the law could be twisted to serve the whims of those who ruled it. Richard II's downfall was no simple coup. It was a masterclass in turning raw power into legal theater. When Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile in 1399 to claim the throne, he faced a dilemma: how to dethrone a crowned king without sparking endless rebellion. The answer lay in weaponizing the law itself, staging a deposition so carefully choreographed that it would look less like treason and more like justice served. What unfolded wasn't just a transfer of power. It was a performance where every word, every gesture was scripted to paint Richard as unfit to rule. The so-called trial in the Tower of London was anything but impartial. Bolingbroke's allies presented a scroll of 33 charges against Richard, accusing him of tyranny, wasting royal funds, and violating the rights of nobles. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Richard himself, forced to read aloud a confession admitting his own failures. Imagine the scene: a king who once believed himself divinely ordained, now reciting words penned by his enemies, declaring himself unworthy of the crown. This wasn't justice, it was psychological warfare, designed to break Richard's aura of legitimacy in front of the very lords who'd once sworn fealty to him. Yet the real brilliance of Bolingbroke's strategy lay in what happened next. Rather than simply declaring himself king, he summoned Parliament to ratify Richard's deposition, weaving his takeover into the fabric of law. The assembly, packed with his supporters, declared the throne vacant by Richard's own voluntary resignation, a fiction so transparent it bordered on farce. But it worked. By grafting his rebellion onto legal procedures, Bolingbroke transformed a bloody power grab into something resembling due process. Future kings would cite this precedent, turning the courtroom into a tool for sanitizing regime change. The chilling lesson of Richard's trial isn't just about one king's fall, it's about how easily law could be bent to serve the victors. Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, didn't just take the throne, he rewrote the story, making his rise seem inevitable and righteous. And in doing so, he proved that in medieval politics, the courtroom could be just as decisive as the battlefield, provided you controlled the script. Gilles de Rais rode into history as Joan of Arc's battle companion, a war hero who fought to crown a king only to plunge into infamy as the most notorious criminal of his age. His trial in 1440 wasn't just about punishing a monster. It was a spectacle that forced medieval society to confront the unthinkable. The charges were staggering: the abduction, torture, and murder of dozens, perhaps hundreds of children, all allegedly committed under the cover of occult rituals. But what made this trial so explosive wasn't just the brutality of the crimes. It was the way the legal system grappled with a nobleman whose depravity shattered every expectation of his class. The courtroom in Nantes became a theater of horror as witnesses recounted tales of vanished children, secret chambers, and black masses. Parents pointed to Gilles's castle as the last place their sons and daughters were seen. Servants whispered of strange fires burning at night, of screams muffled by thick stone walls. Yet for all the lurid testimony, the trial's true drama lay in its contradictions. Gilles, once a marshal of France, initially denied everything, then abruptly confessed in chilling detail, only to recant days later, claiming his admissions were coerced through threats and torture. Was this genuine remorse or the desperate maneuvering of a man who knew his fate was sealed? What's often overlooked is how deeply politics shaped the proceedings. Gilles had squandered his vast fortune on alchemy and pageantry, borrowing heavily from local power brokers before defaulting on his debts. His trial conveniently eliminated a financial liability while allowing the church and crown to posture as moral avengers. Even the timing was suspect. The Duke of Brittany, who presided over the court, stood to reclaim Gilles's lands once he was condemned. Yet the trial's legacy isn't just about corruption, it's about how medieval justice processed the incomprehensible. Without forensic science or psychological understanding, the court leaned heavily on supernatural explanations, framing Gilles's crimes as the work of demonic influence. His eventual execution by hanging and burning served dual purposes: purging a predator and reassuring a terrified public that order had been restored. Gilles de Rais's case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was this justice or merely the performance of it? And in a world where power and superstition intertwined, could the truth ever be fully known? His story remains a dark mirror, reflecting not just one man's evil, but the fragile mechanisms of a system straining to make sense of the unspeakable. At first glance, the feud between Sir Richard Scrope and Sir Robert Grosvenor over a coat of arms might seem trivial, a quarrel over colours and symbols. But in the cutthroat world of medieval nobility, heraldry was anything but decorative. These emblems weren't just family logos, they were visual declarations of power, lineage, and royal favor. When two knights both claimed the right to bear the same design, a simple silver stripe on a blue background, the dispute spiraled into one of the most protracted legal battles of the 14th century, pulling in kings, dukes, and even the poet Geoffrey Chaucer as witnesses. The courtroom became a stage where reputation mattered more than evidence. Scrope, a seasoned warrior with ties to King Richard II, argued his family had used the arms for generations. Grosvenor, a rising knight from Cheshire, insisted his claim was equally valid. But this wasn't just about who painted what on their shields. It was a clash of social climbing versus old money, with Richard II's own authority hanging in the balance. The king couldn't afford to let nobles question the sanctity of heraldic rites, because if symbols of loyalty could be stolen, so could the loyalty itself. What made the trial extraordinary was its scale. Over 2 years, the court heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including war heroes and aristocrats who swore oaths about who wore the arms first. Chaucer, then a clerk of the king's works, testified for Scrope, recalling seeing the design on banners at battles decades earlier. The proceedings exposed a deeper tension. In a society built on hierarchy, even the smallest breach of protocol could unravel the delicate web of fealty and honor that held the nobility together. In the end, Richard ruled in Scrope's favor, but the fallout was revealing. Grosvenor, though forced to change his arms, received a compromise, a similar design with different colors, proving that even in defeat, the king had to save face for all parties. The trial's real lesson: in medieval courts, no dispute was too small when pride and power were at stake. What began as a squabble over stripes became a cautionary tale. In a world where identity was tied to symbols, the courtroom was where those symbols were either sanctified or shattered. Anne Boleyn's trial was less about justice and more about the ruthless machinery of Tudor politics in motion. When she stood accused of adultery, incest, and treason in 1536, the charges were so outlandish they bordered on absurd. 5 men, including her own brother, named as her lovers, with alleged encounters in palace corridors and even the Queen's private chambers. Yet the courtroom wasn't interested in plausibility. This was Henry VIII's masterstroke, a legal charade designed to rid himself of a wife who'd failed to produce a male heir while making room for Jane Seymour. Every detail, from the handpicked jury of Anne's enemies to the lack of concrete evidence, revealed how easily the law could be weaponized by a king determined to rewrite his own story. The trial itself was a study in chilling efficiency. Held in the Tower of London's Great Hall, the proceedings lasted barely 3 weeks. Anne, once the dazzling woman who'd inspired Henry to break with Rome and defy the Pope, now faced a tribunal led by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man more concerned with royal favor than familial loyalty. Witnesses testified to whispered conversations and suggestive glances, but no physical proof was offered. The most damning evidence came from musician Mark Smeaton, whose confession was likely extracted under torture. When Anne protested, her words were dismissed as hysterical denial. The verdict, delivered before the trial even concluded, was a foregone conclusion: guilty. What makes this trial so emblematic of medieval-style justice is its blatant disregard for fairness. Henry didn't need proof. He needed a pretext. By framing Anne's downfall as a legal proceeding rather than an execution of convenience, he gave his actions a veneer of legitimacy. Even her sentence, death by a swordsman imported from France, was staged as an act of mercy, a privilege granted to nobility. But the real message was clear: no one, not even a queen, was safe from the king's wrath if they stood in the way of his ambitions. Anne's trial wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a blueprint for how power could manipulate the law. Within days of her execution, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The Church of England, which he'd created to marry Anne, now served to erase her, and the courtroom, once a symbol of order, had proven itself to be just another tool in the hands of a tyrant. The lesson: in the right hands, justice could be molded like wax, shaped to fit the desires of those who held the seal. The fate of the princes in the Tower is a chilling reminder that in medieval politics, sometimes the most damning trials happened without a courtroom at all. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, the 12- and 9-year-old sons of King Edward IV, vanished in the summer of 1483 while lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection. Their uncle, Richard III, had been named their protector after their father's death, but within months he declared the boys illegitimate and seized the crown for himself. The lack of a formal trial didn't matter. The court of public opinion had already convened, and its verdict was brutal: Richard was guilty of murder. What makes this case so haunting is the absence of concrete evidence. No bodies were found for centuries, no witnesses came forward, and no official charges were ever leveled. Yet the whispers began almost immediately. Even in an era where royal children often died under suspicious circumstances, the prince's disappearance struck a nerve. Their youth, their innocence, and the sheer audacity of their vanishing act turned their story into a rallying cry against Richard's rule. When Henry Tudor invaded England 2 years later, His victory at Bosworth Field was framed not just as a conquest, but as divine punishment for the prince's deaths. The real trial of Richard III played out in pamphlets, chronicles, and ballads. Tudor propagandists, most notably Sir Thomas More, painted him as a hunchbacked monster who smothered the boys in their sleep. Shakespeare later immortalized this version of events, turning rumor into historical fact for generations. But here's the twist: modern archaeology and scholarship have cast doubt on the narrative. The discovery of the prince's skeletons in the tower in the 17th century suggested they died around the time of Richard's reign, but without definitive proof of his involvement. Some historians now argue that Henry Tudor himself or his allies could have staged the crime to tarnish Richard's name. This case exposes how justice in the Middle Ages wasn't always delivered by judges or juries. Sometimes it unfolded in the shadows where accusation alone could condemn a man. Richard's real downfall wasn't a legal verdict, it was the unstoppable force of public belief. Whether guilty or framed, he learned too late that in the battle for power, perception could be deadlier than any sword. The prince's tragedy isn't just a mystery, it's a lesson in how history itself can become the ultimate courtroom, where the truth is often the first casualty. When William Wallace was dragged into Westminster Hall in August 1305, his trial was never meant to deliver justice. It was a meticulously staged spectacle of vengeance. Edward I of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots, had spent years hunting the man who'd humiliated his armies at Stirling Bridge. Now, with Wallace in chains, the king orchestrated a legal farce designed to break Scotland's spirit. The charges treason, robbery, murder were read aloud like a script, while Wallace, denied legal counsel or the right to speak in his own defense, stood silent until the moment the court demanded his plea. Then, with the room bristling with armed guards, he delivered a single thunderous rebuttal. "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." That defiance transformed the trial from a coroner's inquest into a legend. Wallace wasn't just rejecting the charges, he was rejecting England's very right to judge him. The courtroom, packed with English nobles, erupted. Here was a man who'd led a guerrilla war against the crown, evading capture for years, now reducing his captor's pompous legal theater to rubble with 6 words. Edward's response was predictably brutal. Wallace was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered a punishment so grotesque it was reserved for the worst offenders. But the king underestimated the power of that moment. By denying Wallace a fair trial, he'd handed the Scots something far more dangerous than a martyr, a symbol. What makes this trial so pivotal isn't just the grisly outcome, it's how Wallace weaponized the courtroom itself. Stripped of every advantage, facing certain death, he turned the English legal system into a platform for his cause. His refusal to recognize the court's authority echoed across Scotland, fueling resentment that would eventually erupt under Robert the Bruce. Even the details of his execution were carefully calculated to intimidate, yet they backfired spectacularly. Wallace's dismembered body parts were sent to 4 Scottish cities as a warning, but instead of spreading fear, they seeded rebellion. The trial of William Wallace exposes a paradox at the heart of medieval justice. The more brutally a regime punishes defiance, the more potent that defiance becomes. Edward thought he was erasing a rebel. In truth, he was immortalizing one. Centuries later, Wallace's last stand in Westminster Hall would be remembered not as his defeat, but as the moment Scottish resistance found its voice. The courtroom, meant to silence him, became the stage where his legend was born. Jan Hus walked into the Council of Constance in 1414 under the illusion of safety, promised safe passage by none other than Emperor Sigismund himself, only to find himself standing alone against the gathered might of medieval Christendom. His crime, preaching that the church had strayed from its spiritual roots, that indulgences were a sham, and that ordinary people should be allowed to read scripture in their own language. To the cardinals and bishops assembled, Hughes wasn't just a reformer, he was a threat to an entire system of power built on Latin liturgy, priestly authority, and the unquestioned flow of gold into church coffers. What unfolded over those months in Constance wasn't merely a heresy trial. It was a collision between an institution clinging to control and a man who refused to stop speaking truth to power. The courtroom tactics used against Hughes reveal how desperately the church sought to break him. They imprisoned him for months in a dungeon so foul his health collapsed, then dragged him before the council on days when he was too weak to stand. When he demanded to explain his beliefs, his words were twisted or shouted down. Witnesses testified that he denied transubstantiation, a claim Hughes vehemently rejected, insisting he'd only questioned whether priests living in sin could validly perform the sacrament. But theological nuance didn't matter. The trial's real purpose was to force a public recantation, a humiliating spectacle that would discredit his ideas and terrify his followers. When Hughes refused, even as the flames were being prepared, he turned the pyre into a pulpit. What makes Hughes's trial so pivotal is how it exposed the fractures in medieval Christianity. His execution didn't silence dissent, it poured gasoline on a fire that had been smoldering for generations. Bohemia erupted in revolt, with his followers, the Hussites, forming armies that defied papal crusades for decades. The church had hoped his death would be a warning. Instead, it became a rallying cry. A century before Luther nailed his theses to the door at Wittenberg, Hughes proved that ideas could outlive their creators, and that courtroom defeats could sow the seeds of revolution. The trial's bitter irony, many of the abuses Hughes condemned, the sale of indulgences, the corruption of clergy, were the very issues that would later ignite the Protestant Reformation. In trying to erase him, the Church had inadvertently given reformers a martyr, and in the echoes of his defiance, we hear the first tremors of a seismic shift, the moment when faith stopped being something dictated from Rome and began its long, bloody journey toward becoming a matter of personal conscience. The Sicilian Vespers wasn't just a rebellion, it was a people's court in the bloodiest sense, where the verdict was delivered not by a judge's gavel but by the flash of knives and the ringing of church bells. On Easter Monday in 1282, the streets of Palermo erupted in violence so sudden and so coordinated it felt like divine judgment. For years, the French Angevin rulers had squeezed Sicily dry with heavy taxes, arrogant officials, and a contempt for local customs that bordered on provocation. But when a French soldier allegedly insulted a Sicilian woman outside a church, the island's pent-up fury exploded into a massacre. By nightfall, thousands of Frenchmen lay dead, their bodies piled in the streets as the bells that had signaled the uprising's start told their funeral dirge. This wasn't chaos, it was calculated retribution. The Sicilians had turned their island into a courtroom where the oppressed became both jury and executioner. Every detail of the revolt carried symbolic weight. The Vespers, named for the evening prayer service during which the violence began, framed the slaughter as a holy reckoning. The rebels used the chaos of Easter celebrations to mask their planning, proving their grievances were no spur of the moment rage, but a long, simmering demand for justice. Even the choice of targets spoke volumes. Tax collectors, garrison soldiers, and bureaucrats, the very instruments of French oppression, were hunted down while women, children, and clergy were spared. What makes the Vespers unique in medieval history is how it blurred the line between rebellion and jurisprudence. With no sovereign court willing to hear their complaints, the Sicilians created their own brutal form of due process. When they later offered the crown to Peter of Aragon, They weren't just swapping one ruler for another. They were enacting their own version of a legal transfer of power, as if the bloodshed had been the trial and Peter's coronation the sentencing phase. The rebellion's success sent shockwaves through Europe, proving that legitimacy could be revoked at sword point if rulers failed their subjects too egregiously. Yet the Vespers also exposed the dark side of mob justice. For all its cathartic fury, the uprising plunged Sicily into decades of war as the French and Aragonese battled for control. The very people who'd fought for freedom soon found themselves pawns in a larger geopolitical game. The revolt's legacy is a paradox, a triumphant moment of self-determination that also serves as a warning about the cost of justice won outside the law. In the end, the Sicilian Vespers remind us that when courts fail the people sometimes become the court, and their verdicts are written in fire and blood. Robert the Bruce's path to kingship wasn't just a fight for territory. It was a battle for legitimacy waged in the shadow of excommunication and outright condemnation. When he murdered his rival, John Comyn, in a church in 1306, the act wasn't merely a crime. It was sacrilege, a violation so grave it threatened to tarnish his claim to the Scottish throne before he could even grasp it. The fallout was immediate. Pope Clement V excommunicated him, branding him an outlaw in the eyes of God and man alike. For a would-be king in medieval Europe, this wasn't just a spiritual stain, it was a political death sentence. Yet what followed wasn't surrender, but a masterclass in turning legal and religious systems against themselves to forge a crown from chaos. Bruce's strategy hinged on two fronts: the battlefield and the courtroom of public opinion. While his armies fought English forces, his allies worked tirelessly to reframe his narrative. Clergymen loyal to Scotland's cause argued that Comyn's murder, though brutal, had been a necessary act to prevent betrayal, a claim that painted Bruce not as a murderer, but as a patriot forced into impossible choices. Meanwhile, his coronation at Scone just weeks later was a deliberate act of defiance, a statement that Scotland's nobles and clergy recognized his right to rule. Papal disapproval be damned. The ceremonial use of the Stone of Destiny, a sacred symbol of Scottish kingship, wasn't just tradition. It was a calculated rebuttal to his excommunication, grounding his authority in ancient custom rather than Rome's blessing. But Bruce didn't stop there. His eventual victory at Bannockburn in 1314 wasn't just a military triumph, it was a legal argument made with swords. By crushing Edward II's forces, he proved that divine favor might not rest with the Pope's chosen side after all. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, a letter to the Pope signed by Scotland's nobility, took this logic further, asserting that a king's legitimacy came from his people's consent, not just ecclesiastical approval. It was a radical idea for its time, one that subtly undermined the very system that had condemned him. The trial of Robert the Bruce never happened in a traditional courtroom. Instead, it unfolded across years of warfare, diplomacy, and propaganda, with each victory and decree serving as evidence in his favor. His eventual absolution by Pope John XXII in 1324 wasn't a surrender by the Church, but a grudging acknowledgement of reality. Bruce had rewritten the rules. His story reveals a truth darker than any excommunication in the medieval world. Power could sanctify even the bloodiest of sins, provided the winner wrote the history. The law might condemn a man, but victory could absolve him. The murder of Louis of Orleans in 1407 didn't just shock France, it tore open the festering wound of a kingdom already divided. On a darkened Paris street, assassins ambushed the king's own brother, leaving his body riddled with wounds so brutal the killers were initially mistaken for wolves. But this was no random act of savagery. The whispers began at once. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, had ordered the hit. What followed wasn't just a murder trial. It was a proxy war between two branches of the royal family, with the courtroom as their battlefield and the future of France hanging in the balance. John's defense strategy revealed just how cynically the law could be manipulated by those with power. He didn't deny his men had carried out the killing. Instead, he argued it was a righteous act, a tyrannicide to rid France of Louis's corruption. His lawyers painted the victim as a schemer who drained the treasury, seduced noblewomen, and even dabbled in black magic. The courtroom became a propaganda machine, with John's allies distributing pamphlets to the public that framed the murder as a service to the realm. Never mind that Louis's real crime was his rivalry with Burgundy over control of the mad King Charles VI's fragile government. This trial wasn't about truth, it was about who could spin the narrative fastest. The verdict was a masterpiece of political theater. After months of deliberation, John was granted a royal pardon, not because the evidence exonerated him, but because Burgundy's armies loomed outside Paris and the crown couldn't risk open war. The pardon came with one grotesque condition. John had to publicly kneel before Louis's sons and swear remorse. He complied, but the gesture was hollow. As soon as the ceremony ended, he doubled down, commissioning a theologian to write a treatise justifying political murder. The message was clear: justice bowed to power, and the law was just another weapon in a nobleman's arsenal. What makes this trial so revealing is how it exposed the fiction of medieval justice. The courtroom didn't heal France's divisions, it poured salt in them. Louis's supporters, the Armagnacs, seethed at the verdict, while Burgundy's faction flaunted their impunity. Within years, the feud would spiral into civil war, with atrocities on both sides. The trial's real legacy wasn't closure. It was proof that when law becomes an extension of vendetta, even a duke's confession can't stop the bleeding. In the end, John the Fearless would meet his own brutal end, assassinated by his enemies in a grim echo of his crimes. The courtroom had failed to deliver justice, but history, as it so often does, settled the score. The Good Parliament of 1376 stands as a striking anomaly in medieval history, a fleeting moment when the scales of justice tipped not by royal decree, but by the collective outrage of England's governing class. For years, King Edward III's court had festered with corruption, his aging reign overshadowed by greedy favorites like Lord Latimer and the merchant Richard Lyons, who siphoned public funds into private coffers while the kingdom groaned under wartime taxes. But this time, something extraordinary happened. Instead of silent resentment, Parliament transformed itself into a tribunal, wielding its authority not just to complain, but to prosecute. What made this confrontation so remarkable was its sheer audacity. Medieval parliaments were typically rubber stamp affairs, summoned to approve taxes before being dismissed. Yet as the Commons gathered that April, armed with detailed accounts of embezzlement and bribery, they bypassed the king entirely and went straight for his inner circle. Witnesses were summoned, ledgers scrutinized, and damning testimony laid bare how Latimer and Lyons had manipulated wool tariffs and loan schemes to enrich themselves. The atmosphere crackled with tension as the Commons, led by Speaker Peter de la Mare, methodically built their case, knowing full well they were challenging the crown's most protected figures. The trial's outcome was as shocking as its existence. Latimer and Lyons were convicted, stripped of their positions, and imprisoned. Even Edward's powerful mistress, Alice Perrers, was banished from court for meddling in legal affairs. For a few brief months, it seemed the machinery of accountability might actually function. But the real lesson lay in what came next. Within a year, Edward's son John of Gaunt orchestrated a counterattack, dissolving the reformist parliament, jailing de la Mare, and restoring the disgraced officials to favor. The so-called Bad Parliament of 1377 erased nearly every gain, proving how fragile justice became when it dared to touch the untouchables. Yet the good Parliament's legacy outlasted its reversal. It established precedent for impeachment, a tool future generations would wield against crooked ministers. More importantly, it revealed a truth both inspiring and sobering. Even in an age of absolute monarchy, the law could occasionally bite the hands that fed it. The reformers may have lost the battle, but their brief victory illuminated a path others would follow. Centuries later, when English parliamentarians again challenged royal overreach, they would invoke 1376 as proof that no one, not even the king's favorites, was above reproach. The good Parliament's true triumph wasn't in its punishment, it was in proving that the courtroom, however briefly, could become the people's weapon. Isabel Macduff, Countess of Buchan, walked into her trial knowing the verdict before a single word was spoken. Her crime, a single act of defiance that struck at the heart of English rule in Scotland, placing the crown on Robert the Bruce's head at his coronation in 1306. In a world where royal legitimacy hinged on ceremony, her role as the hereditary crowner of Scottish kings wasn't just tradition, it was a political statement. By performing this sacred duty for Bruce, she declared him the rightful monarch in the face of Edward I's conquest. Now, dragged before an English tribunal, she wasn't just a prisoner, she was a message. The courtroom spectacle that followed was designed to break more than just Isabel. Edward, infamously ruthless, understood that crushing a noblewoman would send a sharper warning than executing another rebel lord. Her trial was stripped of legal pretense. No defense was entertained, no witnesses called. The proceedings served one purpose: to frame her act of loyalty to Bruce as treason against England. But what made her punishment so chilling wasn't the sentence itself, it was the theatrical cruelty behind it. Instead of execution, Isabel was condemned to public humiliation, caged like an animal and hung from the walls of Berwick Castle for 4 long years, exposed to the elements and the jeers of passers-by. This wasn't just imprisonment, it was psychological warfare. Medieval justice often used women's bodies as battlegrounds, their punishments serving as cautionary tales for others who might defy male authority. Noblewomen like Isabel were supposed to be passive, their political influence confined to marriage alliances and quiet diplomacy. By stepping into the male realm of kingship and rebellion, she'd violated an unspoken order. Edward's response to make her suffering visible was calculated to terrify other would-be sympathizers into submission, yet the irony is thick enough to taste. However brutal her treatment, Isabel's cage became a symbol of resistance rather than subjugation. While her body was confined, her defiance resonated across Scotland, hardening resolve against English rule. The very spectacle meant to crush dissent only proved how deeply fear had taken root in Edward's regime. And in the end, history remembers not the king who ordered her punishment, but the woman who endured it. Isabel's trial exposes a truth that echoes through the ages. When courts become tools of terror, the condemned often outlast their jailers. In the fog of the 100 Years' War, the battlefield wasn't the only place where fortunes changed hands. The real drama often unfolded in makeshift courtrooms, where the fate of captured nobles was decided not by swords, but by ledgers and legal arguments. Ransom negotiations turned into high-stakes trials, with prisoners' lives reduced to line items in a brutal economy of honor and survival. Take the case of King John II of France, captured at Poitiers in 1356. His captor, Edward the Black Prince, didn't just demand gold. He orchestrated an elaborate spectacle of chivalric theater, hosting banquets where the defeated king dined as an honored guest, while their teams haggled over a sum equivalent to twice France's annual revenue. The message was clear: even in defeat, the law of ransom held more power than the law of the land. What made these negotiations so fascinating was their veneer of civility masking raw calculation. Captors and captives drafted contracts as precise as any modern legal document, specifying payment schedules, hostages for collateral, and even interest rates for late installments. When Bertrand du Guesclin, the famed Breton knight, was captured twice in 3 years, his value was appraised like a piece of real estate, his first ransom set at 100,000 livres, the second slashed to 40,000 when the market for warriors dipped. These weren't just transactions, they were performances of power where the price tag on a man's freedom reflected his political clout as much as his combat skills. But the courtroom drama didn't end with signatures. Breaches of ransom agreements sparked lawsuits that could drag on for decades. After the English knight Sir Thomas Hungerford defaulted on his ransom payments in the 1370s, his French captors pursued him through papal courts, arguing his debts were enforceable under canon law. The case hinged on whether a promise made under duress sword at one's throat was legally binding. The verdict: even war had rules, and honor was a currency as negotiable as coin. The darkest irony lay in how these legalistic rituals masked sheer pragmatism. Ransoms kept the aristocratic class alive, literally. Killing a nobleman meant losing a paycheck, while capturing him funded entire campaigns. The system created perverse incentives. Knights sometimes avoided fatal blows, preferring to incapacitate valuable opponents for profit. Yet this mercenary logic also birthed unexpected alliances. When the French Marshal Jean de Boucicaut was captured at Agincourt, his English captors allowed him to roam London on parole, attending parties and even jousting in tournaments while his ransom was settled. The courtroom of ransom law had its own code of conduct, one where enemies could share a cup of wine today and clash on the battlefield tomorrow. By the war's end, the ransom system had reshaped medieval justice itself. The staggering sums demanded for kings and dukes forced realms to innovate, raising taxes, centralizing treasuries, even pioneering early war bonds. What began as a chivalric custom evolved into a financial engine that fueled state building. Yet the human cost was staggering. For every nobleman who bought his freedom, countless common soldiers rotted in dungeons, their lives deemed too cheap to ransom. The legal battles over captivity didn't just blur the line between war and law. They exposed the brutal arithmetic of medieval power, where a man's worth was measured not in honor but in gold. The Pastoureau uprising began with a spark of divine inspiration, or so its followers believed. In 1251, a charismatic French shepherd named Jacob claimed to have received a vision from the Virgin Mary, calling on the poor to reclaim Jerusalem without the corruption of nobles or clergy. Thousands of peasants, shepherds, and outcasts flocked to his banner, dreaming of a crusade where the meek might inherit the earth. But what started as a holy movement soon curdled into chaos. The Pastoureau, armed with little more than zeal, turned their fury against local priests, Jews, and royal officials, convinced they were purging society of its rot. By the time King Louis IX's forces intervened, the revolt had spiraled into bloodshed, and the courtroom would become the stage for its final, brutal suppression. What makes these trials so chilling isn't just the violence of the crackdown, but how meticulously the legal system was weaponized to enforce social order. The captured rebels weren't simply executed. They were subjected to show trials designed to humiliate as much as punish. Jacob and his lieutenants were paraded before ecclesiastical and royal judges, their crimes framed not just as rebellion, but as blasphemy against the very hierarchy that kept medieval society intact. The charges were a masterclass in political theater: heresy for claiming divine visions, sacrilege for attacking clergy, and treason for daring to challenge the king's monopoly on holy war. The verdicts were never in doubt. Jacob was hanged, his body left to rot as a warning, while his followers were dispersed, some imprisoned, others forced into penance that bordered on slavery. Yet the real lesson of these trials lies in their subtext. The Pastoureau's greatest sin wasn't violence, it was audacity. In a world where peasants were expected to kneel, they dared to preach. Where crusades were the privilege of knights, they'd claimed a divine mandate of their own. The courtroom became a tool to reinforce these unspoken rules, their executions a spectacle to remind the masses of their place. Even the trial records, penned by clerics, drip with contempt, painting the rebels as deluded fanatics rather than desperate souls seeking salvation. But the story doesn't end at the gallows. The Pastoureau's brief, fiery rise exposed the fragility of medieval power structures. Their trials may have crushed the revolt, but they couldn't erase the hunger that fueled it. Within decades, similar uprisings would flare across Europe, each one a little harder to suppress than the last. The courtroom could silence shepherds, but not the ideas that stirred them, and that perhaps was the most terrifying truth of all. Edward the Black Prince's trial by combat in 1352 wasn't just a duel, it was a collision between two irreconcilable visions of justice. When the Gascon nobleman Sir Jean de Carouge accused the squire Jacques Legris of raping his wife, the case seemed straightforward. But in a world where a man's honor was worth more than parchment evidence, the Black Prince, ruling Aquitaine at the time, made a staggering decision. Guilt or innocence would be determined not by testimony or investigation, but by the swing of a sword. This was justice stripped bare, where legal truth hinged on sheer physical prowess, and the courtroom became an arena. What makes this trial so revealing is how it laid bare the contradictions of chivalry. On one hand, the code of knighthood demanded protection of the weak, especially women. On the other, it reduced complex crimes to a binary test of strength, as if God would magically guide the righteous fighter's blade. The Black Prince, himself the paragon of chivalric virtue, didn't just permit the duel, he orchestrated it with ceremonial grandeur. Combatants swore oaths on sacred relics, the field was blessed by priests, and nobles gathered as if attending a tournament rather than a trial. Yet beneath the pageantry lurked a grim reality. Legris, though eventually slain in the duel, might well have been innocent. The system cared less about factual guilt than maintaining the illusion that violence could divine truth. The tension between law and chivalry exploded in the trial's aftermath. While medieval courts were slowly embracing written evidence and witness testimony, cases like this proved how stubbornly the old ways clung to power. Even the Black Prince's own advisors reportedly questioned the verdict, whispering that a man's life shouldn't rest on something as fickle as combat luck. But therein lay the crux of the matter. Trial by combat wasn't about fairness. It was about upholding a social order where nobility and martial skill were conflated with moral superiority. The very spectacle of the duel reinforced the idea that the aristocracy existed above common laws, their bodies and wills instruments of divine judgment. Yet the trial's legacy is more nuanced than it seems. Within decades, the same aristocratic class that cherished these duels began to abandon them, recognizing how easily brute force could masquerade as justice. The Black Prince's own reputation, so carefully built on chivalric ideals, was subtly tarnished by the case's brutality. In the end, this trial didn't just settle a dispute, it became a turning point, exposing the fatal flaw in a system that let swords decide truths too complex for any blade to unravel. The courtroom, meant to uphold order, had revealed just how fragile that order really was. King John II of France faced a crisis that struck at the very heart of his reign, not from invading armies, but from the crumbling reputation of his own elite warriors. In 1352, he summoned the Knights of the Star, an order he'd founded to rival England's legendary Order of the Garter, into a courtroom not for celebration but for condemnation. Their crime, fleeing the battlefield at Moron against the English, an act the king deemed unforgivable cowardice. But this trial wasn't just about punishing failure. It was a desperate attempt to salvage the fading myth of French chivalry by making an example of the men who'd betrayed it. The courtroom proceedings dripped with irony. These knights had sworn an oath never to retreat more than a short distance in battle, a vow so extreme it bordered on theatrical. Now, their very lives hinged on whether they'd broken this impossible promise. Witnesses described chaotic scenes of panic, of golden spurs trampled in the mud as men who'd pledged to die for honor chose survival instead. The king's prosecutors framed their flight as more than military failure. It was sacrilege, a sin against the sacred code that bound nobility to glory. What made the trial so revealing was its brutal pragmatism. John couldn't afford to let his prized order become a laughingstock, not while England's Black Prince outshone French knighthood at every turn. So the verdicts were merciless. Dozens of knights were stripped of their titles, their lands confiscated, their ceremonial swords broken before the court. Some were forced to wear humiliating hooded robes as they listened to sermons on courage, their shame as carefully staged as their former pageantry. A handful faced execution, their deaths serving as grim reminders that chivalry wasn't just a romantic ideal, it was a lethal contract. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a deeper tension. The trial exposed how hollow the chivalric ideal had become. These knights hadn't failed because they were uniquely craven. They'd failed because medieval warfare had changed. The English longbow had turned cavalry charges into suicide missions, rendering the Knights of the Star's oath not just unrealistic, but suicidal. The courtroom, by punishing them for adapting to survive, revealed an uncomfortable truth: honor couldn't stop arrows. John's heavy-handed justice backfired spectacularly. Instead of restoring French knighthood's luster, the trial shattered its remaining credibility. The surviving knights, now branded cowards, fought with even less conviction in future battles, fearing their king's wrath more than the enemy. The Order of the Star, meant to outshine the Garter, became synonymous with hypocrisy and failure. In trying to enforce an outdated code, John had proven just how far reality had drifted from the chivalric dream. The trial's real legacy wasn't in its sentences, it was in its unintended confession. When courts punish men for failing to live up to myths, they admit those myths are already dead. The Knights of the Star didn't just lose their honor in that courtroom. They revealed that honor itself had become a fiction, one even kings couldn't enforce with swords or scaffolds. The bustling ports of the Hanseatic League weren't just hubs of commerce, they were legal battlegrounds where merchants fought not with swords, but with contracts and courtroom stratagems. When a German trader in Bruges accused a Danish merchant of selling rotten herring, or when a Lubeck shipmaster sued for unpaid debts in Novgorod, these weren't petty squabbles. They were high-stakes clashes that tested the very foundations of medieval trade. The League's network, stretching from London to Russia, relied on a web of legal agreements so intricate it became Europe's first prototype of international business law. At the heart of these disputes lay the League's most powerful weapon, its own courts. Unlike royal tribunals swayed by noble whims, Hanseatic judges were often fellow merchants who understood the unspoken rules of cargo weights, interest rates, and grain quality. Their verdicts carried teeth, banishing dishonest traders from lucrative markets or imposing fines hefty enough to bankrupt a small principality. In one landmark case from 1384, a group of English wool merchants learned this the hard way when they tried to skirt Hanseatic quality controls. The League didn't just win compensation, they secured a ruling that forced all English traders in the Baltic to submit their goods for inspection. But the real drama unfolded when the League collided with royal authority. Kings resented these upstart merchants who bypassed crown taxes and operated like a sovereign state. When Edward IV of England arrested Hanseatic traders in 1468, claiming they'd smuggled contraband, the League didn't send soldiers, they lawyered up. Deploying charters dating back to the 12th century, their representatives proved the king had violated ancient trade privileges. The resulting treaty didn't just free their merchants, it forced England to pay reparations in silver. What makes these cases so revolutionary is how they reveal law evolving to serve commerce rather than the other way around. The League pioneered concepts we now take for granted: neutral arbitration, standardized contracts, even early trademarks to combat counterfeit goods. When a Hanseatic court ruled in 1402 that a shipment of Flemish cloth could be rejected for inconsistent dye, they weren't just settling a quarrel. They were inventing quality control, yet the League's greatest legal legacy was its fragility. As nation-states grew stronger, kings began overriding merchant courts with royal decrees. The very system the Hanseatic League had built, where a trader's word carried weight from Bergen to Venice, slowly crumbled under the weight of centralized power. Their courtroom victories, once so formidable, became relics of a fading era where commerce could bend kings to its will. The lesson was clear: in the medieval world, even the most brilliant legal systems were no match for the rise of the modern state. The Visconti family didn't conquer Milan with armies, they seized it through courtroom sleight of hand, turning legal loopholes into stepping stones for an empire. When Archbishop Giovanni Visconti stood trial in 1332, accused of usurping secular power, the charges should have ended his ambitions. But the Visconti didn't play by the rules, they rewrote them. Giovanni's defense hinged on a forged papal bull, a document so convincingly crafted that it temporarily baffled even the church's own lawyers. By the time the forgery was exposed, the Visconti had already cemented their grip on the city, proving that in medieval courts, audacity could outweigh authenticity. What set the Visconti apart wasn't just their ruthlessness, it was their genius for legal theater. Take the case of Bernabo Visconti, who transformed taxation into a weapon. When Milan's merchants resisted his levies, he didn't send soldiers to crush the protest. Instead, he hauled their leaders before a tribunal stacked with his cronies, accusing them of violating obscure trade statutes from 2 centuries prior. The verdict: confiscation of their warehouses and a new loyalty fine payable directly to the Visconti coffers. This wasn't law, it was larceny disguised as jurisprudence. Yet the family's most brazen maneuver came in 1395, when Gian Galeazzo Visconti orchestrated his own coronation as Duke of Milan. The title required imperial approval, so Gian Galeazzo simply fabricated a decree from the Holy Roman Emperor, backdating it to legitimize his rule. When skeptics demanded proof, he produced witnesses who swore they'd seen the original document conveniently lost in a fire. The courtroom, packed with his allies, ratified the lie without a whisper of dissent. The Visconti trials reveal a darker truth about medieval justice. The difference between a dynasty and a crime syndicate often came down to who controlled the gavel. Their legacy isn't just in the castles they built, but in the precedent they set that law could be bent, broken, or invented whole cloth, so long as you had the cunning to sell the story. Centuries later, Machiavelli would cite their tactics in The Prince, but the Visconti needed no manual. They wrote their own rules, one sham verdict at a time. When the peasant leader John Ball stood shackled before his judges in 1381, the courtroom became something far more dangerous than a tribunal. It turned into a pulpit. The fiery preacher who'd once asked crowds, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, now faced charges of inciting rebellion against the crown. But as the bishops and nobles leaned in, expecting groveling repentance, Ball did the unthinkable. He doubled down. "You are not lords by divine right," he thundered, his voice cutting through the stifling air. "You are men like us, clothed in stolen privilege." The gasps that followed weren't just shock, they were fear, because Ball wasn't just defending himself, he was putting the entire feudal system on trial. A peasants' revolt had erupted from a tinderbox of injustice, poll taxes bleeding dry the poor, lords imprisoning laborers who dared seek better wages, and a legal system rigged to keep peasants in their place. When the rebels stormed London, burning tax records and executing hated officials, the establishment reacted with predictable brutality. Wat Tyler, the revolt's military leader, was cut down in a supposed truce meeting with King Richard II, his death a blatant betrayal dressed up as justice. Yet it was in the aftermath, as captured rebels were paraded through kangaroo courts, that the real drama unfolded. These weren't just executions, they were morality plays, staged to remind the masses of their place. What the crown didn't anticipate was how the rebels would weaponize their final moments. In village after village, condemned men turned sentencing hearings into platforms, listing grievances with razor precision. The corruption of sheriffs, the church's hoarding of wealth, the impossibility of surviving on starvation wages. One blacksmith, moments from the news, shouted to the crowd, "They call this law, but it's just theft with a seal." These speeches, though hastily recorded by nervous clerks, seeped into the public consciousness like slow poison. The rebels lost the battle, but their words outlasted the gallows. The trial's aftermath reveals a paradox. While the revolt was crushed, its demands proved impossible to ignore. Within decades, poll taxes were abandoned, wage controls loosened, and serfdom began its slow decline. The courtroom, meant to silence dissent, had accidentally amplified it. By forcing peasants to articulate their oppression under oath, the crown had created a record of injustice too stark to dismiss. Even the king's own judges, some privately sympathetic, began ruling against lords who pushed their tenets too far. The peasants' revolt trials expose a truth that echoes through history. When courts become tools of repression, they sometimes crack under the weight of their own hypocrisy. The rebel speeches, scribbled in margins of official records, became seeds of change. Their real crime wasn't challenging authority. It was proving how fragile that authority looked when ordinary people dared to question it. And in that sense, their defeat was the beginning of a much longer victory. The trial of the Cathars wasn't just about rooting out heresy. It was a holy war disguised as justice, where the courtroom became the final battlefield in a campaign to erase an entire way of life. When Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, the target wasn't a foreign army but a peaceful religious movement flourishing in southern France. The Cathars, with their rejection of church hierarchy and emphasis on spiritual purity, posed a threat Rome couldn't ignore, but exterminating them required more than swords. It demanded the solemn veneer of law. What followed were mass trials so ruthless they blurred the line between inquisition and extermination. Take the infamous massacre at Béziers. When crusaders demanded how to distinguish Cathars from loyal Catholics, the papal legate reportedly declared, "Kill them all." God will know his own. That same brutal logic seeped into the trials that followed. captured Cathars known as perfecti were given a grim choice: renounce their faith or burn. Most chose the flames. Their executions weren't just punishments, they were propaganda spectacles designed to terrify survivors into submission. At the siege of Montségur in 1244, over 200 men and women walked willingly into the fire rather than betray their beliefs, a defiance that shook even their persecutors. Yet the trial's true purpose went beyond theology. The northern French nobility, led by Simon de Montfort, used heresy accusations to justify seizing Cathar lands, turning spiritual purges into real estate grabs. When Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, a Cathar sympathizer, was dragged before a church tribunal, the charges against him, failing to persecute heretics, masked a simpler truth: he stood in the way of northern expansion. Stripped of his titles and humiliated, Raymond's downfall proved how easily faith could be weaponized for conquest. What makes these trials so chilling is their meticulous paperwork. The church didn't just burn heretics, it documented their crimes in obsessive detail, creating archives of forced confessions. Inquisitors like Bernard Gouy perfected interrogation techniques that mixed theology with psychological torment, extracting names of fellow believers under threat of torture. The records reveal a bureaucracy of terror where every confession fed the machine, ensnaring not just the accused but their families, neighbors, even those who'd shown them kindness. The Cathar trials expose a dark truth about medieval justice. Law could sanctify slaughter. By framing genocide as divine mandate, the church and crown didn't just destroy a people, they set a precedent. Centuries later, the same tactics would resurface in witch hunts and pogroms, proving that once courts become tools of eradication, the fires they light are hard to extinguish. The Cathars' real crime wasn't heresy. It was daring to believe differently in a world where orthodoxy and power were one and the same. The courtroom had never seen a defendant quite like Lambert Simnel, a 10-year-old boy crowned as King Edward VI in Dublin Cathedral before his rebellion even reached English soil. When Henry VII's forces crushed the uprising at Stoke Field in 1487, the child pretender became a living puzzle for Tudor justice. He couldn't be executed. His youth and obvious manipulation by Yorkist loyalists made him a pitiable figure. Yet letting him roam free risked inspiring future impostors. Henry's solution was as ingenious as it was bizarre. He pardoned Simnel and put him to work in the royal kitchens, turning a would-be king into a spit-turner. The message was unmistakable: the Tudor regime could afford mercy because its grip on power was unshakable. But Simnel was merely the opening act. 6 years later, a far more dangerous claimant emerged: Perkin Warbeck, a handsome Flemish merchant's son who'd been convinced, or convinced others, he was Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the vanished princes in the Tower. Warbeck's performance was masterful. He spoke flawless English, carried himself with regal grace, and won backing from monarchs as powerful as Margaret of Burgundy and James IV of Scotland. By the time Henry's agents captured him in 1497, Warbeck had led invasions, styled himself as Richard IV, and shaken the Tudor dynasty to its core. His trial wasn't just about punishing an impostor. It was about dismantling a legend. The courtroom strategies deployed against these pretenders reveal the Tudor legal playbook. With Simnel, Henry opted for calculated humiliation, reducing his claim to absurdity by parading the boy through noble households as proof of his common origins. But Warbeck required a different approach. Interrogated in the Tower, he was pressed not just about his actions, but his very identity. Crown lawyers framed his deception as high treason, arguing that by impersonating a prince, he'd attacked the sacred foundation of kingship itself. When Warbeck finally confessed, likely under duress, his signed admission was circulated like a pamphlet, a pre-modern smear campaign to undercut his mystique. Yet the trial's aftermaths proved even more revealing. Simnel's survival as a kitchen servant demonstrated Henry's confidence. Keeping the boy visible was a daily reminder of rebellion's futility. Warbeck, after 2 escape attempts, wasn't so fortunate. Though initially spared, his eventual execution in 1499 showed how Tudor mercy had limits. The contrast between their fates wasn't arbitrary. It reflected a cold calculus of threat assessment. A puppet could be tolerated. A charismatic mimic had to be erased. What makes these trials so pivotal is how they expose the fragility of legitimacy in an age without DNA tests or photographs. In a world where identity hinged on testimony and resemblance, the line between pretender and prince was frighteningly thin. Henry's victories in court didn't just neutralize rivals, they scripted reality itself, rewriting the narrative of who could be king. The Yorkist pretender's real crime wasn't deception. It was proving how easily the throne could be stolen with nothing but a convincing story and the right audience. And in that, they forced the Tudors to confront an uncomfortable truth. Legitimacy wasn't inherited. It was performed. The echoes of these medieval courtroom dramas reverberate far beyond their own time, whispering uncomfortable truths about the relationship between law and power that still shape our world today. Consider how modern legal systems grapple with the same fundamental tensions between fairness and political expediency, between the letter of the law and the might of those who wield it. The spectacle of a king manipulating courts to eliminate rivals finds its parallel in modern show trials and politically motivated prosecutions. The defiant last stands of figures like William Wallace or Jan, whose mirror contemporary activists who turn their trials into platforms for dissent, knowing the verdict was decided before they ever entered the courtroom. What makes these medieval cases so enduringly relevant is how they expose the raw mechanics of power. When Eleanor of Aquitaine was tried for rebellion, or when the Knights Templar were destroyed through fabricated heresy charges, they weren't just facing individual condemnation. They were caught in systems where justice could be manufactured to serve the powerful. This wasn't unique to the Middle Ages. The same patterns emerge in modern corruption cases where laws are selectively enforced, or in extrajudicial punishments disguised as legal process. The medieval courtroom's greatest legacy might be its stark demonstration that laws are only as just as those who control them. Yet there's another, more hopeful thread running through these stories. The very fact that even the most tyrannical medieval rulers felt compelled to stage trials rather than simply executing enemies in dark corners reveals an early recognition that legitimacy requires the appearance of due process. This fragile principle, born in the smoke-filled halls of feudal justice, eventually grew into modern concepts like habeas corpus and the right to a fair trial. The rebels and dissenters who weaponized their own trials, turning them into public spectacles of defiance, laid the groundwork for the idea that law could be a shield for the powerless as well as a sword for the powerful. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in the paradox at the heart of these cases. The same courtrooms that served as tools of oppression also became unexpected arenas for resistance. When Thomas Beckett invoked papal authority, or when Joan of Arc outmaneuvered her interrogators, they proved that legal systems, however rigged, could still be turned against their masters. This duality survives in modern courts, where landmark civil rights victories and oppressive verdicts often emerge from the same institutions. The medieval world understood what we sometimes forget, that law is never neutral ground. It's a battlefield where the rules themselves are part of the contest, and every verdict writes another line in the endless story of who gets to control the narrative. These 25 trials remind us that justice is never final, only fought for anew in every generation. The robes and rituals change, but the essential drama remains, the struggle to make law a servant of truth rather than a weapon of power. When we watch a high-profile trial today, we're not just seeing a legal proceeding, we're witnessing the latest act in a play that began 1,000 years ago, on the stone floors of medieval halls where the stakes were life, death, and the very meaning of justice itself. Medieval courtroom dramas were never just about guilt or innocence, they were battles for control, fought with words instead of swords. These trials reveal a truth as sharp as any blade. Justice has always been a mirror, reflecting who holds power and how fiercely they cling to it. Whether it was a queen like Eleanor of Aquitaine stripped of her authority, or a peasant rebel like John Ball shouting defiance from the gallows, the courtroom became the stage where societies decided who deserved to be heard and who could be erased. Think about the echoes of these medieval struggles in our own time, when a king like Richard II was deposed through a sham trial, or when the church silenced dissenters like Jan Hus with heresy charges. They weren't just settling scores, they were testing the boundaries of what people would accept as fairness. The same tensions simmer today, whether in politically charged prosecutions or the way privilege can tilt courtroom scales. The robes and rituals may have changed, but the essential question remains: who gets to define justice and for whose benefit? Yet there's hope in these stories too. For every corrupt tribunal, there were moments of breathtaking courage: Joan of Arc outmaneuvering her interrogators, Thomas Beckett standing firm against a king, or the pastoral rebels exposing the hypocrisy of their oppressors even as they faced execution. These weren't just defeats, they were proof that the powerless could weaponize the courtroom too, turning trials into platforms for truths too dangerous to ignore. So as we close this journey through medieval justice, consider this: the past isn't just a collection of old scandals. It's a blueprint showing us how fragile justice can be when it's yoked to power, and how resilient it becomes when ordinary people demand better. The next time you hear about a high-profile trial, listen for the whispers of history. You might just recognize the same dramas playing out centuries later, with different costumes but the same high stakes. If these stories gripped you, let's keep the conversation alive. Which of these 25 cases left you stunned? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most unforgettable moments. After all, the past is never really past, it's just waiting for us to pay